Welcome back to Hold On, Survival Stories, where we explore the incredible tales of courage, determination, and the unbreakable will to survive against all odds. I'm your host, and today we have a story that will redefine your understanding of heroism and loyalty. When we think of heroes, we often picture firefighters rushing into burning buildings, paramedics saving lives, or soldiers protecting their country. But sometimes, heroes come in unexpected packages. They have 4 legs, a wet nose, and an unwavering devotion that transcends human understanding. Today's story takes us to the aftermath of one of the most devastating earthquakes in recent California history, where a 6.7 magnitude quake reduced entire city blocks to rubble in a matter of seconds. In the chaos that followed, as search and rescue teams worked around the clock to find survivors, they discovered something extraordinary buried beneath tons of concrete and twisted steel. A love story between a man and his dog that would capture the hearts of millions and redefine what it means to never give up. This is the true story of Winston, a 12-pound Jack Russell Terrier, and his 78-year-old owner, Harold Chin, whose 3-day ordeal trapped beneath a collapsed apartment building would become one of the most remarkable survival stories ever documented. It's a story about loyalty that defies logic, about the incredible bond between humans and their pets, and about how sometimes the smallest among us can be the greatest heroes of all. But most importantly, it's a story about holding on not just to life, but to hope, to love, and to the belief that miracles can happen even in the darkest places on Earth. This is the story of 2 survivors who refused to give up on each other, and the dedicated rescue team who refused to give up on them. Tuesday, March 15th, started like any other day for Harold Chin and his beloved companion, Winston. Harold, a retired librarian who had lived in the same rent-controlled apartment in San Francisco's Richmond district for over 30 years, was enjoying his morning coffee and reading the newspaper when Winston, his energetic Jack Russell Terrier, jumped onto his lap, demanding attention. At 78 years old, Harold had slowed down considerably from the active man he once was, but Winston kept him young at heart. The 12-pound terrier had been Harold's constant companion for the past 8 years, ever since Harold's wife, Margaret, had passed away from cancer. In many ways, Winston had saved Harold from the devastating loneliness that follows the loss of a life partner. Their daily routine was simple but meaningful. Morning coffee together, a walk around the neighborhood, where Winston would greet every person and dog they encountered, lunch while listening to classical music, an afternoon nap where Winston would curl up against Harold's chest, and evening television with Winston sprawled across Harold's feet. It was a quiet life, but it was filled with the kind of contentment that comes from unconditional love. Harold's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building constructed in 1925, long before modern earthquake safety standards were implemented. The building housed 12 units, home to a mix of elderly long-term residents like Harold and young professionals who appreciated the neighborhood's charm and relatively affordable rent. At exactly 2:47 p.m., Harold was in his favorite armchair, reading a biography of Winston Churchill, the historical figure his dog had been named after. When Winston suddenly became agitated, the little terrier began pacing frantically around the apartment, whining and pawing at Harold's leg with an urgency that seemed out of character. "What's wrong, boy?" Harold asked, setting down his book. "Do you need to go outside?" But Winston's behavior wasn't about needing a walk. Dogs have a remarkable ability to sense seismic activity before humans can detect it. Winston was feeling the P waves, the faster-moving preliminary waves that precede the more destructive S waves of an earthquake. His canine instincts were screaming that danger was imminent. 30 seconds later, the world exploded into chaos. The earthquake struck with a violence that defied description. In an instant, Harold's orderly apartment became a nightmare of falling furniture, shattering glass, and walls that seemed to be tearing themselves apart. The sound was deafening, a combination of grinding concrete, snapping wood, and the terrifying roar of a building destroying itself. Harold was thrown from his chair as the floor beneath him began to buckle and tilt. His last clear memory before the ceiling came down was seeing Winston leap toward him, as if trying to shield him from the falling debris. Then everything went black. The Loma Prieta earthquake, as it would later be called, lasted only 15 seconds. But in those 15 seconds, it generated enough destructive force to collapse dozens of buildings, damage thousands more, and change countless lives forever. Harold's building, with its unreinforced masonry construction and lack of seismic retrofitting, was among the structures that couldn't withstand the violent shaking. The 4-story building pancaked, with each floor collapsing onto the one below it. Harold's 3rd-floor apartment was crushed between the weight of the floor above and the debris of the floors below. What had been a cozy, sunlit home became a tomb of concrete, steel, and shattered dreams. But in a small pocket of space beneath what had once been Harold's kitchen table, a heavy oak piece that had belonged to his grandparents, 2 lives hung in the balance. Harold Chen lay unconscious, his body battered but alive, with Winston pressed against his chest, the little dog's body providing warmth and his presence providing something even more precious: hope. The immediate aftermath of the earthquake was chaos on a scale that the San Francisco Bay Area had never experienced. Emergency services were overwhelmed, with calls flooding in from across the region. The collapsed building in the Richmond district was just one of dozens of structures that had failed, and with limited resources, rescue teams had to prioritize their efforts based on the likelihood of finding survivors. For the first 24 hours, Harold and Winston's building received only a preliminary assessment. The structure was deemed too unstable for immediate search and rescue operation. The decision was made to focus on buildings where survivors had been confirmed, or where the structural damage was less severe. It was a heartbreaking but necessary calculation that emergency responders have to make in large-scale disasters. With limited personnel and equipment, they have to deploy their resources where they can save the most lives. Harold and Winston's building, with its complete structural collapse, was classified as a lower priority for immediate search operations. But Harold and Winston weren't alone in their concrete tomb. Throughout the collapsed building, other residents were trapped in similar pockets of space. Some were injured, some were unconscious, and some were already beyond help. The building had become a maze of debris, with survivors scattered throughout multiple levels of collapsed floors. As the first day turned into the second, and the second day approached the third, the chances of finding survivors in Harold's building grew increasingly slim. The human body can survive only a limited time without water, and the psychological trauma of being trapped in complete darkness often leads to panic and despair that can be as deadly as physical injuries. But Winston had something that human survivors didn't have: an unwavering loyalty and a simple, uncomplicated understanding of his purpose. His job was to protect Harold, and he was going to do that job regardless of the circumstances. Hour after hour, Winston lay across Harold's chest, sharing his body heat and occasionally licking Harold's face, as if trying to keep him conscious. When Harold would stir slightly, Winston would lick his face more urgently, as if trying to communicate that he was there, that they were together, that Harold shouldn't give up. When Harold was completely still, Winston would press closer, using his small body to provide what warmth he could. The little terrier had no food and no water, but he had something more powerful: an unbreakable determination to keep his human alive. By the third day after the earthquake, the focus of search and rescue operations had shifted to what emergency responders call last chance scenario. These are the locations where the probability of finding survivors is extremely low, but where teams make final sweeps before declaring areas unsalvageable. Harold's building had been scheduled for this type of final assessment, not because anyone expected to find survivors, but because protocol demanded that every structure be thoroughly searched before being written off. The building's complete collapse made it one of the most challenging rescue sites in the entire disaster zone. Captain Maria Rodriguez of the San Francisco Fire Department's Urban Search and Rescue Task Force had seen more than her share of disaster sites in her 15-year career. She had worked the aftermath of the Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, had been deployed to tornado sites in the Midwest, and had participated in international disaster response missions. But even with all her experience, the sight of Harold's building was sobering. This is going to be a recovery operation, not a rescue, she told her team as they prepared to begin their search. The building's been down for 3 days. We're looking for bodies now, not survivors. But we do this right, and we do it with dignity for the families. The search team consisted of 8 highly trained specialists, each with specific skills essential for urban search and rescue operation. There was Captain Rodriguez, the team leader with expertise in structural assessment. There was Jake Morrison, a paramedic with advanced trauma training. There was Dr. Lisa Park, a physician who specialized in crush injury and hypothermia. There was Tommy Santos, an engineer who could assess structural stability in real time. There was Sarah Williams, a K-9 handler with her German Shepherd, Rex, trained to detect both living and deceased victims. And there were 3 additional rescue specialists trained in confined space operation. The team's approach was methodical and scientific. They used sensitive listening equipment to detect any sounds that might indicate survivors. They employed thermal imaging cameras to look for heat signatures that could suggest living victims. They used ground-penetrating radar to map the internal structure of the collapsed building and identify potential void spaces where people might have survived. For the first 2 hours of their search, the team found exactly what they expected: silence. The building appeared to be a tomb, with no signs of life anywhere in the massive pile of debris. They had located 3 bodies in the initial search, residents who had been killed instantly when the building collapsed. Sarah Williams and Rex, the search dog, were working the eastern side of the building when Rex suddenly became alert. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and he began pawing at a particular section of debris with unusual intensity. Rex is indicating something, Sarah called out to Captain Rodriguez. He's showing signs of a live find. Search dogs are trained to behave differently when they detect living victims versus deceased ones. Rex's behavior, the pawing, the excited whining, the intense focus on a specific location, suggested that he was detecting someone who was still alive. Captain Rodriguez approached with her electronic listening equipment, a device so sensitive it could detect a human heartbeat from several feet away. She placed the sensor against the debris where Rex was indicating and listened carefully. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, she heard a sound so soft it was almost inaudible. It wasn't a human voice or a heartbeat. It was something else entirely. "I'm hearing something," she announced to her team. "It's very faint, but it's definitely biological." "Jake, Lisa, get over here." Jake Morrison, the paramedic, listened with his own equipment. Dr. Park used a different type of sensor, designed to detect respiratory patterns. Tommy Santos began assessing the structural integrity of the debris pile to determine if it was safe to begin digging. "I'm getting respiratory patterns," Dr. Park reported. "Very faint, but definitely there. The rate is faster than human normal, maybe 30 to 40 breaths per minute. That's not human," Jake noted. "Human respiratory rate would be 12 to 20 breaths per minute, even under stress." Captain Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. We're going to assume there's a survivor down there, regardless of species. If there's a living creature trapped in that debris, we're going to get it out. The decision to proceed with a rescue operation was not made lightly. The structural instability of the debris pile made any excavation extremely dangerous. One wrong move could cause a secondary collapse that would kill both the trapped victim and the rescue workers. But the team had detected signs of life, and their training demanded that they exhaust every possible effort to save whoever was down there. Tommy Santos spent the next hour carefully assessing the debris pile, using ground-penetrating radar and his engineering expertise to map the safest possible route to the source of the sounds. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. There's a void space about 12 feet down, he reported. It looks like it was created by a piece of furniture, probably a table or desk, that created a protective pocket when the building collapsed. The good news is that the space appears to be stable. The bad news is that it's surrounded by extremely unstable debris. We're going to have to hand dig our way down, and we're going to have to shore up the walls as we go. Hand digging through 12 feet of concrete, steel, and debris is a process that can take many hours, even with a full team working in shifts. Every piece of rubble has to be carefully removed and assessed to ensure that its removal won't cause a collapse. Every few feet, the walls of the excavation have to be reinforced with steel supports to prevent cave-ins. As the team began their painstaking excavation, they continued to monitor for signs of life from the void space below. The faint breathing sounds continued, but they seemed to be getting weaker. "Whatever's down there, Doctor," Park observed, "it's been without food and water for 3 days. Even if we reach it, we might be looking at a recovery rather than a rescue." But Captain Rodriguez had made a commitment, and she intended to see it through. "We dig until we reach that void space," she announced. "Every life is worth saving." 4 hours into the excavation, when the team had dug down about 6 feet, they heard something that stopped everyone in their tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of barking. "There's a dog down there," Sarah Williams said, her voice filled with excitement. Rex was right. There's a dog alive in that void space. The discovery of a living dog changed the entire dynamic of the rescue operation. Dogs can survive longer without food and water than humans, but 3 days is still pushing the limits of survival. More importantly, if there was a dog in that void space, there might also be a human survivor. If there's a dog down there, Captain Rodriguez reasoned, there's probably a person down there too. Dogs don't usually end up in buildings alone during earthquakes. Someone was taking care of that dog. The team's urgency increased, but they couldn't compromise safety for speed. The excavation continued, foot by foot, with the barking growing slightly louder as they got closer to the void space. 8 hours into the dig, when they had reached a depth of about 10 feet, they heard something that made everyone's heart race. Mixed in with the weak barking, they could hear what sounded like human groaning. "We've got a person down there," Jake Morrison announced. "I'm hearing human vocalizations." The discovery that there were potentially 2 survivors in the void space, a human and a dog, transformed the rescue operation from a routine recovery to a race against time. After 3 days without food or water, both victims would be in critical condition. Every minute counted. The excavation had reached the most dangerous phase. At 10 feet deep, the rescue team was working in a narrow shaft, surrounded by unstable debris that could collapse at any moment. The walls had been reinforced with steel supports, but the deeper they dug, the more precarious the situation became. Captain Rodriguez made the difficult decision to rotate her diggers every 30 minutes to prevent fatigue-related accidents. Working in the confined space was physically and mentally exhausting, and tired rescuers make mistakes that can be fatal. "Remember, we're not just digging," she reminded her team. "We're also listening. If those sounds stop, if we lose contact with our survivors, we need to know immediately. Dr. Lisa Park had been monitoring the vital signs they could detect through their equipment. The breathing patterns from the void space were becoming increasingly irregular, suggesting that whoever was down there was deteriorating rapidly. We're looking at severe dehydration, possible hypothermia, and likely some traumatic injuries, she reported. Based on the breathing patterns, I'd estimate we have maybe 2 to 4 hours before we're looking at a recovery instead of a rescue. The psychological pressure on the rescue team was enormous. They knew that 2 lives hung in the balance, and that every shovelful of debris they removed could be the difference between life and death. But they also knew that moving too quickly could cause a catastrophic collapse that would kill everyone involved. Tommy Santos was constantly monitoring the structural integrity of their excavation. His instruments detected micro-movements in the debris pile that indicated the entire structure was on the verge of shifting. "We're right at the edge of stability," he warned. "Any significant vibration or impact could bring the whole thing down." At the 11-foot mark, they encountered a major obstacle, a large piece of concrete that appeared to be a section of floor from one of the upper apartments. The concrete slab was too large to lift out of the excavation, but it was blocking access to the void space where the survivors were trapped. "We're going to have to break it up," Tommy announced after careful assessment. "But we can't use heavy equipment or pneumatic tools. The vibrations would destabilize the entire pile. Breaking up concrete by hand is a slow, labor-intensive process." The team used small sledgehammers and chisel, working carefully to fracture the concrete into manageable pieces. Each impact had to be measured and controlled to avoid creating vibrations that might cause a collapse. The work was made more difficult by the fact that they were working in a confined space with limited visibility. Battery-powered lights provided illumination, but shadows and debris created an environment where every movement had to be carefully calculated. As they worked, the sounds from the void space continued: weak barking from the dog, and occasional groaning from the human survivor. But the sounds were getting fainter, and the intervals between them were getting longer. "We're losing them, Doctor," Park observed grimly. "The breathing patterns are showing signs of severe physiological distress." Jake Morrison, the paramedic, was preparing intravenous fluids and emergency medical equipment for the moment when they would finally reach the survivors. "We need to be ready to provide immediate medical intervention," he said. "After 3 days without water, they are both going to be in critical condition." The breakthrough came at 2:30 a.m., exactly 12 hours after the rescue operation had begun. Tommy Santos was carefully chipping away at the concrete slab when his chisel suddenly broke through into empty space. "I've got a hole," he announced. "I can see into the void space." Captain Rodriguez immediately moved to the opening with a powerful flashlight. What she saw in that narrow beam of light would stay with her for the rest of her career. In a space no larger than a small closet, an elderly man lay unconscious on his back. Draped across the man's chest was a small dog, barely moving but clearly alive. The dog's eyes reflected the flashlight beam, and it lifted its head slightly in response to the light. "We've got 2 survivors," Captain Rodriguez announced. "An elderly male, unconscious, and a small dog. The dog appears to be protecting the man." The sight was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The little dog, despite being severely dehydrated and weakened by 3 days without food or water, was still maintaining its protective position over its human companion. "The dog's been keeping the man warm, Doctor," Park observed through the opening. "Body heat transfer has probably been crucial to the man's survival. But seeing the survivors was only the first step. Getting them out of the void space would require enlarging the opening without causing a collapse, and then carefully extracting 2 critically injured victims from a confined space 12 feet below ground level. We need to widen this opening, Tommy Santos assessed. But we have to do it incrementally. The structural integrity of the void space itself is questionable. The process of enlarging the opening took another 4 hours. Every piece of debris had to be carefully removed, and the opening had to be reinforced to prevent collapse. The team was working against time, knowing that both survivors were in critical condition. As they worked, they maintained contact with the survivors. The dog would occasionally lift its head and make weak barking sounds. When it heard the rescue team talking, the man remained unconscious, but his breathing, while shallow, was steady. "Hey there, little guy," Sarah Williams called down through the opening. "We're going to get you out of there. You're doing great. You're both doing great." The dog seemed to respond to human voices, and the rescue team began talking to both survivors continuously, believing that human contact might help maintain their will to survive. At 6:30 a.m., 14 hours after the rescue operation began, the opening was finally large enough to attempt extraction, but the process would require extreme care. Both survivors were too weak to assist in their own rescue, and the confined space made it nearly impossible to use standard rescue equipment. Jake Morrison was the smallest member of the team, and he volunteered to be lowered into the void space to assess the survivors and prepare them for extraction. It was a dangerous decision. If something went wrong, the team would have 3 people to rescue instead of 2. If you feel any instability, any movement in the debris, you call for immediate extraction, Captain Rodriguez ordered. We're not losing a rescuer to save victims who might not survive anyway. Jake was lowered into the void space on a safety rope, carrying emergency medical supplies and assessment equipment. What he found when he reached the bottom was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Harold Chen, the elderly man, was unconscious but alive. His vital signs were weak but steady. He had multiple injuries, a broken arm, several broken ribs, and a head injury that had caused significant bleeding. But he was breathing, and his heart rate, while slow, was regular. Winston, the little dog, was in remarkably better condition than expected. He was severely dehydrated and weak, but he was alert and responsive. When Jake reached toward him, Winston's tail wagged weakly, the first sign of his normal personality that he had shown in 3 days. "The dog's been lying across the man's chest," Jake reported to the team above. "He's probably been sharing body heat and providing psychological comfort. This little guy is a hero." But the most remarkable discovery was yet to come. As Jake began his medical assessment, he realized that Harold Chen was not just unconscious, he was in a diabetic coma. The man was a diabetic, and the stress and trauma of the earthquake had thrown his blood sugar dangerously out of balance. "We've got a diabetic emergency down here," Jake reported. "The man's blood sugar is critically low. He needs immediate glucose intervention, and he needs it now." The discovery explained why Harold had survived 3 days without food or water. His body had been conserving energy by shutting down non-essential functions. But it also meant that his condition was even more critical than they had realized. The extraction of Harold Chen and Winston from their underground prison required a level of precision and care that tested every skill the rescue team possessed. They had 2 critically injured victims in a space so confined that standard rescue equipment was useless, and they had to perform the extraction without causing a collapse that would kill everyone involved. Jake Morrison, still in the void space, began the delicate process of preparing both survivors for extraction. Harold's condition was critical. He was in a diabetic coma, severely dehydrated, and suffering from multiple traumatic injuries. Winston, while in better condition than his owner, was also severely dehydrated and weak from 3 days without food or water. "I need to get some glucose into the man immediately," Jake reported to Dr. Park above. His blood sugar is so low that I'm surprised he's still alive. Dr. Park lowered an Roman 4 kit and glucose solution into the void space. Administering an Roman 4 in normal conditions requires steady hands and good lighting. Doing it in a confined space, 12 feet underground, with an unconscious patient and unstable debris overhead, was a medical procedure that few practitioners would ever have to attempt. Jake's hands shook slightly as he searched for a vein in Harold's dehydrated arm. After 3 days without water, Harold's veins had collapsed, making Roman 4 placement extremely difficult. It took 3 attempts before Jake successfully established an Roman 4 line and began administering glucose solution. Roman 4 established, Jake reported. I'm pushing glucose now. The dog is stable but dehydrated. He's been incredibly calm throughout this whole process. Winston seemed to understand that help had arrived. He remained protectively close to Harold, but he allowed Jake to examine him, and even accepted small amounts of water from a syringe. His tail wagged weakly when Jake spoke to him, and he licked Jake's hand with obvious gratitude. This dog has been keeping his owner alive, Jake told the team. He's been providing warmth, comfort, and probably psychological support. The man might not have survived without him. The extraction plan required careful coordination. Harold would have to be removed first, since his medical condition was more critical, but Winston would have to be extracted immediately afterward, since leaving him alone in the void space would likely cause panic and stress that could worsen his condition. Tommy Santos had calculated the safest method for extraction. They would use a rescue basket designed for confined space operations, but the basket would have to be lowered vertically through the narrow opening and then maneuvered into position in the void space. The margin for error is essentially 0. Tommy warned. If we bump the walls of the void space or create any significant vibration, we could trigger a collapse. Captain Rodriguez made the decision to clear non-essential personnel from the immediate area. If something went wrong during the extraction, she wanted to minimize the number of people at risk. The process began with Jake carefully moving Harold into position for extraction. Harold was still unconscious, but his vital signs had improved slightly since receiving glucose. Jake had to immobilize Harold's broken arm and provide cervical spine protection before he could be moved. Patient is secured and ready for extraction, Jake reported. But I need to warn you, he's got multiple fractures, possible internal injuries, and severe dehydration. This transport needs to be as smooth as possible. The rescue basket was lowered into the void space with painstaking care. Every movement had to be slow and controlled to avoid creating vibrations that might destabilize the surrounding debris. It took nearly 30 minutes to position the basket properly and secure Harold for transport. As Harold was being prepared for extraction, Winston became agitated. The little dog seemed to understand that he was being separated from his owner, and he began whining and trying to follow the rescue basket. The dog's getting stressed, Jake observed. He doesn't want to be separated from his owner. Sarah Williams, the K9 handler, had an idea. Lower me down there, she suggested. I can handle the dog, while Jake manages the human extraction. The dog needs to see that he's not being abandoned. It was a risk to put another person in the void space, but Sarah's expertise with dog made her the best choice for managing Winston during the extraction process. Sarah was lowered into the void space just as Harold was being lifted out. She immediately began speaking to Winston in calm, reassuring tones, letting him know that he was safe and that he would be reunited with his owner. Easy, boy, she whispered. You've done such a good job. You saved your dad. Now we're going to take care of both of you. Winston seemed to respond to Sarah's presence. His agitation decreased, and he allowed her to examine him more thoroughly. Despite his ordeal, he was remarkably responsive, and even showed signs of his natural terrier personality. Harold's extraction took 45 minutes. The rescue basket had to be lifted slowly and carefully, with team members guiding it through the narrow opening and stabilizing it to prevent impact with the debris walls. When Harold finally reached the surface, Dr. Park immediately began advanced medical treatment. "He's alive, but he's in critical condition," Dr. Park reported. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately. The glucose helped, but he needs intensive care." An ambulance was standing by, and Harold was transported to San Francisco General Hospital while still unconscious. But his vital signs were stable, and Dr. Park was cautiously optimistic about his chances of survival. Now it was Winston's turn. The little dog had watched his owner being lifted away, and despite Sarah's reassurances, he was clearly stressed about being left behind. "You're next, little guy," Sarah told him, as she prepared a specialized animal carrier for his extraction. "We're going to get you out of here and back to your dad." Winston's extraction was technically easier than Harold's, since he weighed only 12 pounds compared to Harold's 140. But emotionally, it was more challenging. Winston didn't understand what was happening, and he was frightened about being separated from Harold. Sarah had to use all her expertise with animal psychology to keep Winston calm during the extraction process. She maintained constant verbal contact with him, using soothing tones and reassuring words. "You're the bravest dog I've ever met," she told Winston, as she secured him in the carrier. "You saved your daddy's life. You're a hero." Winston's extraction took 20 minutes. When he finally reached the surface, he was immediately examined by Dr. Park, who had returned from the hospital after ensuring Harold was stable. "The dog's in better shape than I expected," Dr. Park reported. "He's dehydrated and weak, but he's alert and responsive. He's going to need Roman 4 fluids and careful monitoring, but I think he's going to make a full recovery." Winston was transported to the emergency veterinary clinic, where he received immediate treatment for dehydration and exhaustion. The veterinarian who examined him was amazed by his condition. After 3 days without food or water, trapped in a confined space with a critically injured human, this dog should be in much worse condition, the veterinarian observed. His will to survive and his dedication to protecting his owner probably kept him going when most animals would have given up. The successful extraction of both Harold and Winston marked the end of an 18-hour rescue operation that had pushed every member of the team to their limits. But it also marked the beginning of a recovery process that would test the bonds between man and dog even further. Dr. Walsh was initially resistant to the idea, but Harold's condition was deteriorating due to his anxiety. She agreed to a compromise. Winston could be brought to a window outside the ICU where Harold could see him, but the two would remain separated by glass until Harold's condition improved. The reunion, even through a window, was emotionally overwhelming for everyone who witnessed it. When Sarah Williams carried Winston to the window of Harold's ICU room, the little dog immediately began wagging his tail and pressing against the glass. Harold, despite his weakness, managed to raise his hand and place it against the window where Winston was pawing from the other side. "He knows I'm here," Harold whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He knows I'm okay." Winston's response was equally emotional. The little dog, who had been listless and anxious since the separation, suddenly became animated and alert. He pressed his nose against the glass and made soft whining sounds, as if trying to communicate with Harold through the barrier. "The change in both of them is remarkable," Dr. Walsh observed. "Mr. Chen's vital signs have stabilized, and his anxiety levels have decreased significantly just from seeing his dog." The daily window visits became a crucial part of both Harold and Winston's recovery process. Every morning, Sarah Williams would bring Winston to the hospital, and the two companions would spend time together, separated only by glass. Harold would tell Winston about his treatment and recovery, and Winston would wag his tail and press against the window in response. I think Winston understands more than we realize, Harold told Dr. Walsh during one of his recovery sessions. He's always been incredibly intelligent, but what he did during those 3 days, keeping me warm, staying with me, probably saving my life, that goes beyond intelligence. That's love. As Harold's condition improved, Dr. Walsh began to consider the possibility of allowing Winston to actually visit Harold in his room. The hospital's therapy dog program had been suspended due to earthquake-related staffing shortages, but Winston's case was unique. This isn't just about pet therapy, Dr. Walsh explained to the hospital administration. This is about treating 2 patients who literally saved each other's lives. Their recovery is interconnected. After extensive discussion and the implementation of strict safety protocols, the hospital made an unprecedented decision. Winston would be allowed to visit Harold in his room for short periods, under careful supervision. The first physical reunion took place on Harold's 7th day in the hospital, when Sarah Williams carried Winston into Harold's room. The little dog immediately jumped onto the bed and curled up against Harold's side, the exact same position he had maintained during their 3-day ordeal in the collapsed building. He remembers, Harold said, gently stroking Winston's fur. He remembers keeping me warm. Winston's presence had an immediate positive effect on Harold's recovery. His appetite improved, his cooperation with physical therapy increased, and his overall emotional state stabilized. The nurses reported that Harold slept better when Winston was in the room, and his vital signs remained more stable. The bond between Mr. Chen and Winston is unlike anything I've seen in my medical career, Dr. Walsh noted. They're not just owner and pet, they are survivors who depended on each other for survival. Their relationship transcends the typical human-animal bond. As news of Harold and Winston's story spread, it began to attract international attention. Major news networks picked up the story, and social media was flooded with posts about the heroic little dog who had saved his owner's life. The story resonated with people around the world who understood the special bond between humans and their pets. The San Francisco Fire Department received hundreds of letters and emails praising the rescue team's efforts. Captain Rodriguez and her team were invited to appear on national television programs to tell the story of the rescue operation. What made this rescue special wasn't just the technical challenge, Captain Rodriguez explained in one interview. It was the reminder that heroism comes in all sizes. Winston weighs 12 pounds, but he had the heart of a lion. He never left his owner's side, never stopped protecting him, never gave up hope. 2 weeks after the rescue, Harold was stable enough to be moved to a regular hospital room, and Winston was cleared for extended visits. The little dog had made a complete physical recovery and was back to his normal energetic self, though he remained notably protective of Harold. Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinarian who had treated Winston, was amazed by the dog's resilience. Most animals who experience this kind of trauma show lasting psychological effects, he explained. But Winston seems to have processed the experience as a successful protection of his owner. He's actually more confident and alert than before. Harold's recovery was progressing well, but the experience had changed him profoundly. I've always loved Winston, he told reporters who came to interview him. But what happened in that building? It showed me that love isn't just an emotion. It's an action. Winston didn't just love me, he actively saved my life. The rescue team continued to monitor both Harold and Winston's progress. Jake Morrison, the paramedic who had been lowered into the void space, visited them regularly and had become almost like family to both of them. What I saw in that hole Jake reflected was the purest form of loyalty I've ever witnessed. Winston had every reason to panic, to try to escape, to give up, but he stayed. He kept Harold warm, he kept him company, and he probably kept him alive through sheer determination. As Harold's strength returned, he began to understand the full scope of what had happened during their ordeal. The doctors explained how Winston's body heat had helped prevent hypothermia, how his presence had likely provided psychological comfort that helped Harold's body conserve energy, and how his barking had ultimately led to their rescue. "Winston was my guardian angel," Harold said during one of his interviews. "People think of angels as having wings, but sometimes they have 4 legs and a tail." The story of Harold and Winston's survival had touched something deep in the public consciousness. In a world often filled with tragic news, their story offered hope and reminded people of the profound bonds that can exist between humans and animals. Letters and cards poured in from around the world. Children sent drawings of Winston as a superhero. Other earthquake survivors shared their own stories of how pets had provided comfort during disasters. Animal welfare organizations reported increased adoptions, with many people specifically requesting older dogs or smaller breeds like Jack Russell Terriers. The San Francisco SPCA created a special fund in Winston's name to provide emergency veterinary care for pets whose owners were hospitalized due to disasters. The fund raised over $100,000 in its first month, demonstrating the impact that Harold and Winston's story had on people's generosity. 3 weeks after the rescue, Harold was finally discharged from the hospital. The moment when he and Winston walked out of the hospital together was captured by dozens of photographers and news cameras. But for Harold and Winston, the attention was secondary to the simple joy of being together again. "We're going home," Harold whispered to Winston as they left the hospital. "We're both going home." But home was complicated. Harold's apartment building had been completely destroyed in the earthquake, and most of his possessions were buried in the rubble. At 78 years old, with limited income and no family nearby, Harold faced the daunting prospect of starting over. The rescue team had anticipated this problem. Captain Rodriguez had been working with local housing authorities and charitable organizations to find temporary housing for Harold and Winston. But the response from the community was overwhelming. A local family whose home had been damaged, but was still habitable, offered Harold and Winston a place to stay. A furniture store donated a bedroom set. A pet supply company provided a year's worth of food and supplies for Winston. The neighborhood where Harold had lived for 30 years rallied to support him. "Harold and Winston are part of our community," said Maria Santos, a neighbor who had known Harold for years. "They survived something incredible together, and now we're going to help them rebuild together." The support extended beyond material needs. Harold received job offers from several organizations who wanted to hire him as a spokesperson for disaster preparedness. While he declined most of these offers, he did agree to work with the Red Cross to help develop educational materials about earthquake safety for pet owners. People need to understand that in a disaster, you're not just responsible for yourself, Harold explained. If you have pets, you need a plan for them too. "Winston saved my life, but I had a responsibility to keep him safe as well." 6 months after the earthquake, Harold and Winston had settled into a new apartment in a building that met modern earthquake safety standards. Harold had used the insurance money from his destroyed apartment, combined with donations from well-wishers, to secure a home that would be safer for both of them. Winston had become something of a local celebrity. Children in the neighborhood would stop to pet him and ask Harold to tell the story of their rescue. Winston seemed to enjoy the attention, though he remained perpetually close to Harold's side. "He's never more than a few feet away from me now," Harold observed with a smile. "I think the experience bonded us even more than we already were." The earthquake had changed both of them in subtle but meaningful ways. Harold had become an advocate for disaster preparedness, particularly for elderly residents and pet owners. He spoke at community meetings and worked with local emergency services to develop better plans for animal rescue in disasters. Winston had become more alert and protective, though he retained his friendly disposition. Veterinary behaviorists who studied his case noted that he showed no signs of trauma, but rather seemed to have gained confidence from his successful protection of Harold. Winston processed the earthquake experience as a victory. Dr. Rodriguez explained. He had a job to do: protect Harold, and he succeeded. That success actually strengthened his confidence and his bond with his owner. The rescue team members had also been changed by the experience. Captain Rodriguez incorporated lessons learned from Harold and Winston's rescue into her training programs for other urban search and rescue teams. The importance of listening for any signs of life, regardless of how faint, became a key component of her teaching. "Winston's barking led us to Harold," she reminded her trainees. "If we had given up when we first heard animal sounds, we would have missed saving both of them. Every life is worth saving, and sometimes the smallest voices lead us to the biggest rescue." Jake Morrison, the paramedic who had been lowered into the void space, kept a photo of Harold and Winston on his desk. He often shared their story with other emergency responders who were dealing with difficult cases. "When I'm working a scene that seems hopeless," Jake explained, "I think about Winston lying across Harold's chest for 3 days, never giving up, never leaving his side. It reminds me that determination and love can overcome incredible odds." Sarah Williams, the K-9 handler, had been so moved by Winston's story that she began training her own dogs to detect both human and animal victims in disaster situations. Her work led to changes in search and rescue protocols that improved the chances of finding both people and pets in collapsed buildings. The scientific community also took notice of Harold and Winston's case. Researchers studying human-animal bonds found that their survival story provided valuable insights into how emotional support can affect physical survival in extreme circumstances. Harold's survival was aided by Winston's presence in ways that go beyond simple body heat, explained Dr. Rachel Kim, a researcher at UC San Francisco who studied the case. The psychological comfort of having his beloved companion with him likely helped Harold's body conserve energy and maintain vital functions during the ordeal. The story of Harold and Winston became part of the curriculum at veterinary schools and emergency response training programs. It demonstrated the importance of considering pets as family members in disaster situations and highlighted the remarkable bonds that can exist between humans and animals. As we reach the end of this remarkable story, it's important to remember that Harold and Winston's survival was about more than just luck or determination. It was about the profound bond between a man and his dog, and the extraordinary lengths to which they would go to protect each other. In the aftermath of the earthquake, when investigators studied the collapsed building, they found that the void space where Harold and Winston had been trapped was the only habitable area in the entire structure. Every other potential survival space had been completely crushed or filled with debris. It was essentially a miracle that they ended up in the one place where survival was possible, Tommy Santos, the structural engineer, explained. But what happened in that space over 3 days was an even greater miracle, a testament to the power of love and loyalty. Winston's actions during those 3 days went far beyond normal dog behavior. He didn't just stay with Harold out of confusion or fear. He actively worked to keep Harold alive. He provided warmth, comfort, and a reason to keep fighting. When Harold was unconscious, Winston was his guardian. When Harold was awake, Winston was his companion. Dogs are remarkable creatures, reflected Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinarian who treated Winston. But what Winston did transcended normal canine behavior. He became Harold's lifeline, his protector, and ultimately his savior. Harold's dedication to Winston was equally remarkable. Even while trapped, injured, and in a diabetic coma, Harold's instinct was to protect his beloved companion. The bond between them was so strong that their survival became intertwined. Neither could have made it without the other. Today, 2 years after the earthquake, Harold and Winston continue to live together in their earthquake-safe apartment. Harold, now 80, moves a little slower than before, but Winston, now 10, still has plenty of energy. They take their daily walks around the neighborhood, where Winston greets every person and dog they encounter with the same enthusiasm he always had. Their story has been featured in documentaries, books, and countless news articles. But for Harold and Winston, the attention is secondary to the simple joy of being together. People ask me if I think Winston is a hero. Harold said in a recent interview. Of course he is, but he's not a hero because he saved my life. He's a hero because he loved me enough to stay with me when everything else was falling apart. He's a hero because he never gave up on me, even when giving up would have been easier. The rescue team that saved Harold and Winston has gone on to help other disaster victims, but they all agree that this rescue was special. It reminded them why they do this work, not just to save lives, but to reunite families and preserve the bonds that make life worth living. In our line of work, we see a lot of tragedy, Captain Rodriguez reflected, but we also see incredible examples of love, loyalty, and the human spirit. Harold and Winston's story represents the best of all of those things. As we conclude this episode of Hold On, Survival Stories, the message is clear. Heroism comes in all sizes. Love knows no boundaries, and sometimes the smallest among us can teach us the most about courage, loyalty, and the will to survive. Harold and Winston's story reminds us that in our darkest moments, we're not alone. Whether it's a faithful companion, a dedicated rescue team, or a community that rallies to help, there are always those who will refuse to give up on us. Winston may weigh only 12 pounds, but he has the heart of a giant. Harold may be 80 years old, but his love for his companion is timeless. Together, they survived the impossible and showed the world that the bonds between humans and their pets are among the strongest forces on Earth. In a world that often feels divided, their story reminds us of what we share: our capacity for love, our determination to protect those we care about, and our ability to find hope even in the darkest places. Harold and Winston didn't just survive a collapsed building. They survived by holding on to each other, holding on to hope, and holding on to the belief that love is stronger than any disaster. That's the kind of story that gives us all reason to hold on. Fade to closing music. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Hold On, Survival Stories. If you have a survival story you'd like to share, please reach out to us through our website. Until next time, remember to hold on to hope, hold on to love, and hold on to each other. Producers note: this episode was produced with the full cooperation of Harold Chen, the San Francisco Fire Department, Urban Search and Rescue Team, and the veterinary professionals who treated Winston. A portion of the proceeds from this episode will be donated to the Winston Fund at the San Francisco SPCA, which provides emergency veterinary care for pets whose owners are hospitalized due to disasters.